There's only one lap, I know that, but it's a long, long way.
In Australian motorsport, it's an event like no other. 18,500 kilometres in 20 days across some of the toughest terrain in the world. A race where some drive to win, but most just to survive. From a Brisbane start, the competitors wind their way down the east coast to Melbourne, across to Adelaide, up to Alice Springs, over to Perth and up the west coast to Darwin, through Mount Isa and Townsville, and back to Brisbane for a Gold Coast finish. Round Australia trials are few and far between. The last one was held in 1979. 16 years later, on a sunny Brisbane day in June, 150 cars lined up for another crack at the Big Lab. Given the top-ranking competitors that were present, picking a winner was tough. The biggest name was 9-time Bathurst winner Peter Brock, the winner of the 1979 Round Australia Tour. Ross Duncan was also there in 1979. He finished fourth in a Volvo. This time, he was in a Commodore as part of the Holden team. Rally specialist Ed Ordinsky and navigator Ross Runnels completed the Holden team. The 1990 Australian Rally champion was expected to be one of the first cars back after 3 weeks on the road. Then there was Michael Guest. If the 26-year-old from Newcastle could keep his Mitsubishi on the road, he'd more than match it with the veterans for outright speed. Bruce Garland headed up the recreational four-wheel drive charge for outright honours in a Holden Jackaroo. The four-wheel drives, with their durability and speed in rough conditions, were expected to play a big part in the final placings of the 95 adventure. In '79, Brock led the Holden Commodores to an historic 1-2-3 finish in the Round Australia trial. The cars and the haircuts may have changed considerably since then, but both Brock and Duncan were ready to do it all again.
There's a different approach to it all nowadays, and now I tend to sort of say, okay, I now know how to attack the outback of Australia. You don't go at it hell for leather. You've got to approach it with a lot of circumspection, a lot of, I suppose, a lot of understanding that it's a very difficult terrain to read, and you've got to just drive along at 6 or 7 tenths through it.
In 1979, I followed the Commodores, and we finished fourth, so they were first, second and third. Back in '79, I said, if I ever go in it again, I'd like to be in that team.
Nah, you got the key?
Yeah.
Then, of course, there were entrants like Victor Willman and George Mingan in their 1972 Jaguar. Their two main aims? To finish and have a bit of fun.
Peter Brock starting up the engine of his
For Bob Watson and his team of organisers, years of hard work finally paid off when Brock was the first car away in the '95 Mobil 1 trial. One by one, they departed on what could be, given the cost and logistics, the last great Round Australia adventure.
Ladies and gentlemen, for Ed Ordinsky and Ross Runnels, taking off in car number 3.
The early trial leaders were husband and wife David and Kate Officer in their Mitsubishi Lancer. Ed Ordinsky was nestled in behind them, with Michael Guest in his Mitsubishi an impatient third. Peter Brock expected setbacks, but not all in the first couple of days. By the time he hit Sydney, he'd run off the road, had a flat, and put a stick through his radiator.
Instead of it disappearing underneath the car, somehow it's got itself skewed around, poked through the front bumper bar, and pierced a hole in the radiator. So that meant that Dave Boddy and I spent about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, I may be out there pulling, changing radiator, letting the engine cool down, and it was just one of those things. I thought, do I really need to go through this this exercise? But it's there to be done.
The challenge for drivers in the early days of the rally was to stay amongst the leaders down the east coast, but not knock their cars about too much before the tough outback stages. For the Holden Commodores, it was also important to keep pace with the specialist rally cars. The special stages on closed roads were where teams could make up time on the competitors. During the transport legs on open roads, they had to stick to the normal speed limits. As the field approached Melbourne, the officers were still out in front. with Dunkerton lurking close behind. And Bruce Garland already hassling the leaders in his Jackaroo. Dunkerton and co-driver Noel Richards made it to Melbourne in fine form, but then everything started to go wrong. There was a close encounter of a kangaroo kind. More roofs. And finally, disaster.
300, keep left. Over a wooden bridge, just watch it. Not caution. 200. 100, keep left. Halt! Halt!
With one wheel missing, Dunkerton and Richards were going to have to do some lateral thinking, which they did, as this amateur footage shows. With Richards riding in the boot and Dunkerton driving from the passenger's seat, they limped the final 15 kilometres to the next service point for a quick fix, plummeting from 3rd overall to 27th. With two of the biggest names already well back in the field, the trial was proving every bit as tough as its reputation. Ed Ordinsky in 3rd spot was now carrying the hopes of the Holden team. And with 16,000 kilometres still to go, winning the 95 trial was going to require almost as much good fortune as good driving. The trial continued through Adelaide and north towards Alice Springs for the first of the tough Outback stages, where the heavier recreational four-wheel drives were expected to excel.
Car 162, we need you to move over.
Dunkerton and Richards were desperately clawing their way back into the trial with some inspirational driving. Not that everybody was being helpful.
Can't do it, going right. Can't do it, mate, I can't. All right.
Now this is what rallying in the Outback is all about.
Meanwhile, the boys in the Jag were getting a tough introduction to Outback driving. Like Dunkerton, Brock was also overhauling a few.
There's Brock, there he is.
And the boys in the Jag were proud to let him past. But couldn't resist the chance to get a bit of their own back on one of their idols. But the officers who'd led since day one, the trial ended when they blew a transmission near Alice Springs, allowing the hard-charging guest to take over, while Ordinsky, who had avoided any major drama, discovered being second was just as dirty and dusty as being third.
I can't describe how difficult it was, the risks you took at times to be competitive when you're just sitting in blinding dust. You don't look forward to that sort of thing, I can tell you.
But that's exactly what Ordinsky had to do as the field charged along the Gun Barrel Highway towards Kalgoorlie. Back at Ayers Rock, another magic moment for Vic, George and the Jag.
And the Rocket.
Guest and his co-driver, Rod Salmon, got to Kalgoorlie first with a handy 7-minute lead over Ordinsky. And they were confident they could maintain it.
Yeah, both Rod and I have got a good attitude towards this event, and we're trying to conserve the car, and we went through there very quickly, and with the car was fine, and with no damage done to the car, and certainly trying to conserve the car, and that's the attitude we're going to try and keep the whole way.
This is course 4, reporting that there are between 10 and 20 vehicles involved at instruction 44 on the railway stage. Over.
As the competitors emerged from the dust, there was more bad news for Peter Brock. But if there's one thing Brock's learned in all his years behind the wheel, it's how to break bad news gently.
Well, we've superficial damage the left-hand front fender and bonnet. The bloke stopped in front of us, spun in the middle of a long, far straight, and I just caught his left-hand rear bumper bar. He spun to a stop in front of me, he was actually trying to pull over, but instead of pulling over, he actually blocked the road, if you know what I mean.
Once Brock got into town, the crew took over.
I bet we haven't got a spare air filter assembly.
Straightened out the damage best they could. And it was back into the fray for Brock. Meanwhile, Dunkerton's charge had taken him from 18th to 8th.
Take it 5% easier on the rough bits. It's a long way to go. We're trying to get a puncher.
And on they charged up the inhospitable west coast, Guest clinging tenaciously to his lead, Ordinsky staying in touch despite 12 days straight in blinding dust.
Well, you always go faster than you think is possible. Roads don't suddenly just disappear out of sight. And if you want to go fast in dust, you have to assume it's straight until you have good reason to see otherwise. So you go a lot quicker than your mind is telling you should.
With service vehicles and crew members ready to cope with any disaster, the rule of thumb was, if the driver could get to a service point, they'd fix it.
George, changing a fan belt.
But for those with no budget, it was just a case of making do.
Bloody navigator.
We did Gibb River Road, which went for hours and hours, and no wind, just the dust.
No sleep catches up with you after a while. You know, we get 2 hours every second night, and we had 2 hours last night, and you're starting to nod off now when you're driving down the road. You do a 300 or 400 kilometre transport.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
As the field approached Catherine, the drivers were 13 days and 13,000 kilometres into the trial. Lack of sleep and constant blinding dust were really starting to take their toll.
Dust is horrendous.
It doesn't taste like crocodile or shark, it just tastes like bloody dirt, I think. But you can definitely chew it. 3, 2, 1.
All the cars are getting pretty tired, so are the crews. So, you know, the next 4 or 5 days is going to play the tune as far as the rally goes.
Dunkerton's prediction was spot on as far as Michael Guest was concerned. After leading the event for 7 days, he suffered his first major setback.
We had an electrical short, and then we had a fire in the boot, and we had to put that out and then rewire the fuel pumps in the stage, and we got a puncture and sat in the bull dust for 60 kilometres, and it wasn't a lot of punch. We got 20 minutes, so we'd be just second there.
We're holding on to second by about 2 minutes, we reckon.
Things are going downhill fast, you know.
They could be worse, but
anyway,
not much.
we're going to go. There you go.
For Adinsky and the Mobil Commodore, everything was starting to fall into place.
It was just the most fantastic feeling to break out of the dust finally when Michael Guest suffered his problem and I got to be first car on the road. It was like breathing fresh air for the first time.
In what turned out to be one of the most eventful stages of the entire trial, Bruce Garland rolled his 4th place Jackaroo, badly damaging it and injuring navigator Harry Suzuki.
He wasn't going to make the corner, so I elected to go off, and we went straight in through the trees, and she come down the left front corner, and it rolled right over. Harry's got his arm fixed in the door, I think. And it came back onto its wheel, so we started it up. I've only lost about 30 seconds, but the car's a bit second-hand.
The welcoming lights of Darwin gave drivers and crew a much-needed brush with civilization. But in the early hours of the morning, it was back on the road. One of the toughest tasks for the service crews and safety marshals was to keep ahead of the competitors and keep themselves amused during the long hours spent waiting. Meanwhile, Vic and George were more than happy to stop the Jag at any time and capture another magic moment on video.
Done about 150 miles of this, and that's all you see, just flat land, nothing else.
As the drivers raced towards Mount Isa, Ordinsky was building a sizable lead with Guest still second, Steve Ashton and Roe Nixon in their Mitsubishi third.
Through that way. And then straight on.
It was in the Isa that Dunkerton finally conceded that, for him at least, the trial was over.
We've lost possession on, I think it's number 1 cylinder there, so it looks like we might be out of it.
The high-speed duel between Ordinsky and Guest continued, with the younger of the pair always willing to take a chance.
We caught Ed fairly early on in that stage. Because of the dust, we had a bit of trouble trying to get past him, and called him a few times and he wasn't real keen to let us pass, which I was starting to get a bit annoyed about, so we ended up passing him at a gate.
Rules of this event he should follow, and leaving gates open, not closing them behind himself and so on is not on.
Townsville, 3/4 of the way through the event, and everything was pointing towards a repeat Holden win. The job of keeping the Holdens on the road fell to this man, George Shepherd. He masterminded the Commodore's triumphant competition debut back in 1979.
The cars themselves have actually performed very well. The drivers, because they've had various things working against them, Duncan having an early accident in the rally and then having to work his way back through the dust, and a very similar situation for Brock has caused them a lot of anguish getting through the dirt and the slow competitors.
We've been in touch the whole way. As you know, we've been sitting in second and third most of the event, and now we've got to try and bring it home.
Townsville marked the turn for home, and although Ordinsky's Holden had run faultlessly and his lead was more than 20 minutes, Guest was wringing every ounce of speed he possibly could out of his Mitsubishi.
It's not realistic to think we can just catch second by just going faster, but what we are doing is making sure that we're keeping them honest and we're keeping pressure on them to keep going hard.
The recreational four-wheel drives, while prominent, weren't having the impact they were expected to, prompting rumblings from their drivers that road conditions hadn't been tough enough.
I think we incorporated four-wheel drives because they're now part of the general Australian motoring scene, but I certainly can't agree that it hasn't been hard enough. I mean, the four-wheel drives, there's a whole raft of them there in the top 10 placings, so I don't see what they're complaining about, really.
At Rockhampton, the locals were cooking up a storm.
This is just for a crew coming in the night. There's 13 in it, they rang me out and I said, get the bloody tucker going. I said, yeah, right,
For Ed Ordinsky and navigator Ross Runnels, it was about to get a lot tougher. With an historic win virtually in their grasp, they blew a gearbox.
50 competitive kilometres left in an event of that length. I just couldn't believe it had happened.
Ordinsky's huge lead was suddenly looking vulnerable. Every minute spent off the road was another minute less that Michael Guest had to make up. The first priority for the service crew was to commandeer a workshop in the tiny town of Woodford, just out of Brisbane. When Ordinsky arrived, they were ready.
Then we had the critical factor of the gearbox change. 20 minutes at the absolute outside. The car needed its normal routine service as well. And a gearbox to be changed. The underside of the car was very heavily protected, so there were a lot of minutes lost in getting those guards off. You know, we drove into that workshop and we drove out again 19 minutes later with everything done, guards back on, new tyres, fuel, even the windows cleaned. It was an amazing job.
Despite the brilliant work by the Mobil Holden service crew, Ordinsky's lead was whittled back to around 5 minutes. Guest was trying a bit too hard to make up the rest.
I hadn't had a spin for about 3 years in a rally, I don't think, and that's the first one. Full spin, and it was good. Right around, so went down into handbraking and then shot up and then...
They don't normally spin, they roll, don't they?
Back at me if the TV camera's not... We come out of the dust and here's the boys with the camera. I went, oh no, this will be on TV tonight for sure. So.
With the end of the arduous tour in sight, the boys were getting a bit boisterous.
See, Ed's hair's gone all grey at the back all of a sudden. I think it's from work.
We got two hair on his hair. Is that Grecian 2000, Ed?
It only happened on this trip.
Yeah, the last day I reckon it sort of started out.
Time-wise, the car should be okay. We've still got to keep driving it neatly and it's going to be the skin of our teeth, but we'll carry it home on our backs if necessary.
The final stage, the next day, and with Ordinsky across the line, it was appropriately titled The Fat Lady Sings, complete with one rather sus large lady.
Oh, Peter!
Help! Get my car protest immediately.
Well, it's only I can sing to you. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, you finished your little wonder, you're a ripper. Big kiss for me.
But I think the main effort right from the start was to achieve a win. And we've done that, and I think that in doing that alone, you know, we're pretty happy, yeah.
Ah, it's a feather. It's like you, Brock.
One by one, the large crowd welcomed the exhausted crews and their cars to the Gold Coast. Among them, Vic and George in the Jag. Bruce Garland was the first of the four-wheel drives, finishing an excellent 4th place overall. Steve Ashton and Roe Nixon crossed in third, and Michael Guest enhanced his reputation with a well-deserved second. But by far, the biggest accolades were saved for Ed Odinsky and Ross Runnels in their Mobil Commodore for a superb tactical drive that will be remembered for years to come.
Unbelievable. The crowds down here and the boys are just... they've worked on this for so long. You can imagine it's going to be a pretty big night for them. From a personal point of view, so few people in the sport can say they've won a Round Australia event. It's an absolute one-off. You know, George Shepherd said to me in the event, you get one chance in your life to win one of these, and I had the chance and I did it. You know, it's a very good thing.